Welcome back to the leading edge of integrative mental health. I'm your host, Lisa Dale Miller. You can subscribe and stream The Groundless Ground on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Pandora, Stitcher, Google Podcast, Amazon Music, TuneIn, and YouTube. And of course, find out more at groundlessground.com. Clinician Paula Scatoloni returns to the Groundless Ground 6 years later to share the evolution of her clinical work, which now integrates sound therapies and energy medicine along with somatic psychotherapy. This is a fascinating episode covering several kinds of sound modalities, such as the Safe and Sound Protocol, a unique listening experience which has been filtered through a patented, evidence-based algorithm highlighting specific sound frequencies which help regulate the autonomic nervous system and stimulate the vagus nerve. Binaural beats, which present one tone to one ear and a second tone to the other ear, inducing the brain to perceive a third tone. Proponents of binaural beats assert these sound waves enhance certain beneficial brain waves, though those claims lack good clinical research. And finally, biofield tuning, which utilizes a tuning fork to identify and resolve energetic disturbances in the subtle body nervous system. While all this may sound far-fetched, Paula and I try our best to present it with the clarity and level-headedness you deserve. Paula Scatoloni, a lot seems to have shifted for you in how you're practicing.
Yes, thanks for having me back. It's been too long.
So just to remind people where we were the last time we met, at that time, you were doing this really incredible work with eating disorders, starting to expand out from that narrow window of psychopathology.
Yes, and that has taken off. It's now an institute of training, and Rachel Lewis is running it, and therapists are coming to learn about working with the body, surprise, surprise, with eating disorders.
And somehow, I'm getting the sense that in this 6 years, something happened for you that allowed you to step back a little, and you're doing really interesting things. Give us a sense of what happened.
Well, what happened for me was what happened for a lot of people. COVID happened, right?
Oh, that.
Yes. So, there was lots of gifts within that, as well as, changes. For some, it was movement, a physical movement to the other locations. And for me, it was a professional shift. And I would say more expanded perspective of what healing is. And so I was in this box of working with eating disorders and trauma, utilizing primarily Kathy Kane and Steve's work. And I was already at the time utilizing sound because I had started to use this specific sound program developed by Dr. Porges in 2017, like playing around with it with myself. And I was using it and combining it with touch work. And so for those that don't know the Safe and Sound Protocol, it was developed for children with autism, and the trauma community got a hold of it. And a very dear SE friend of mine who's no longer here literally tossed it across the room and said, put this on and see what it does. And being a good SEP, that's what I did, right? Because we love that. We love to learn. But I began using it, and I was treating eating disorders using the Safe and Sound Protocol in the way it was designed. But I also was a touch provider, and I was finding that for specifically cases that had the eating disorder terminology where they don't really know what's happening and they just like avoidant food restriction and spontaneously vomit and they don't know why. And so I was finding with the Safe and Sound program and the touch work, I was having phenomenal results. So I was already getting curious about sound and what was happening even before COVID. And I knew during the sessions I could see, and I was starting to log the phenomenology.
So when you say the phenomenology of it, I don't know what that means, but
Sure.
I'm curious, in what ways were you noticing phenomenological experience internally Or were you noticing phenomenological experience in the people you were working with?
Good question. I would say both. I would say that in using it with the touch, I was finding that the coherence in the system and the feeling a nervous system move from dysregulation into regulation over time and being consistent. I was tracking that at a rate with very disorganized people, right? Because they were spontaneously vomiting and very disorganized to the point where they were absolutely non-symptomatic by the end. So it really piqued my curiosity around what was happening. Is this me? Was this the program? Was this the combination? Once COVID hit, I couldn't touch anymore and I wasn't seeing people online. So I pivoted to online and began to use the program and combine it with somatic resourcing. So all the things we would use in a somatic session. So they might bring their weighted blanket or bring something warm and put it on their kidneys while they were listening. And I found I was getting the same results. So then I got even more curious. And around that time, maybe even a little before, I guess I started to tune more into the different things that can happen when you start to work with touch and energy. And so I became more sensitive to understanding that there's different ways to gather information. And as a somatic therapist, we might gather it, through our own body because we're biofeedback machines. But then I began to notice and experience and engage as well through my vision channel or through the other channels of knowing that were helping me to understand that there were many processes occurring at the same time. It opened my world, and I began to then move into the study of working with subtle energy and other processes that were more indigenous based. So I could even go back to somatic experiencing and say, okay, what's the premise of healing across the board? And I'm going to go back to the roots, and then I'm going to sit with this and see what happens with the sound over time and try to understand it from holding both the modern and the indigenous together. And so it was that process within myself as I went through that I came to understand how healing takes place and the importance of the provider's own presence, attunement, and use of the field itself. And so it opened me up in a way to understanding the phenomenology of healing that felt like it was kind of put in a box during my training in a way that I could understand it through my lens that I had at that time, which was like the nervous system or the psychology. I didn't feel like I had a fully comprehensive understanding of how the physical body, the subtle energy system, the emotional body, and the mental body are all connected, right? And so people that study yoga or other practices that understand the mind-body systems already have that. But I was coming from the field of psychotherapy. I'm not a yoga instructor, right? So I was building up my understanding. And then how sound fit in was I began to understand that it could penetrate all of those systems simultaneously so that there were changes in belief systems, in physiology, in the emotional realm, in the subtle energy, in the way that the person's organized in regulation. But also, I would even say, because of my comfort level and my willingness to invite the process to keep expanding, we began to work with ancestral material and things that would fall under broader perspectives around healing. So the sound opened up the potential for thinking about things differently, even health and healing differently, right? Because I shifted away from this idea of fixing. My client has a diagnosis and I'm going to fix it, to an understanding of healing and all the possibilities that we have when we're gifted with a challenge that we call a symptom, right? But it's how we hold that very symptom can turn out to be a gift. I've evolved into a more somatically integrative provider since COVID because of that.
You keep saying the word sound, and I'm imagining during COVID, you were having to deliver the sound through whatever portal you happen to be using at the time to do your session.
The program we used, we had them on MP3 players at the beginning, but when COVID hit, they were able to put it onto an app. And it took a while and they rushed and they got it done. And so it became an app. So the person could have the app on their phone.
You were not hearing the sound they were hearing.
No.
But you knew what the sound was enough to have a sense of what they might have been hearing.
There's about 5 somatic experiencing providers. And we wrote a manual for Dr. Porges to explain what the SSP does. If we want to talk through the SE lens, it's providing a passive resource to the system as you would with any SE model, right? We're going to bring in the resource. And then the body, because the safety is coming through that auditory pathway, starts to go through cycles.
So the safe and sound protocol becomes a phenomena to orient to. Is that what I'm hearing?
It's part A. And then the second part is the provider's resonance. So the two together.
Which would be true no matter what somebody was orienting to, even if they were
Totally.
orienting to a displeasurable phenomena.
Yes.
What I'm hearing you say is that this particular kind of sound that Steve Porges came up with does something very particular in the system to allow attending to a resource with a little bit more ease, I think, maybe a little more effortlessly.
It's passive. So you don't do anything. You just put the headset on. You get taken through a neural exercise where you're receiving the frequencies of safety, and then your system is responding. It's an algorithm that's based on the frequency of safety and then doses it to you. If the provider is really astute and attuned to that somatic resonance, because this is focused on the neurological structures of the attachment system.
Yes.
If you have a provider that can meet in that way, in the same way you would if you were touching people on a table, then now if there's dysregulation that occurs from that, the system shifting, that gets absorbed and reorganized through the provider's presence. It can be quite calming, but it can also be very expansive in terms of what comes up to process and even transcendent. The more the person comes into deeper and deeper embodiment, the more capacity of those sensory systems that allow us to experience things beyond the 5 senses. That's very similar to psychedelics in that way. And so, so people have things that feel like a psychedelic experience when they're listening.
Maybe we should say non-ordinary, which I think is important because Stan Grof, he ended up defining non-ordinary states in a very open and inclusive manner.
I would say this falls into that realm.
So it sounds like you're in with the sound was the Safe and Sound protocol.
It was the beginning of the journey for me.
Yeah.
In individually and then in groups, I began to use it.
I thought maybe you would want to say a little bit about some of the other ways in which you've been exploring sound as a healing form.
Also during COVID, since we all had so much time and we all like to train. So I took a dive into biofield tuning, which uses sound on and off, but mostly I learned and found that how I could use it was more off the body. So I started to work with the hologram around the body with sound. And I found that I could do SE with a tuning fork. We hit the tuning fork and then we scale across the person's field from 5 feet away in. And then you hit pockets where you can hear the fork change, or you can sense into, okay, we've hit some overcoupling, some density.
We need to back up and slow down.
Okay.
You just opened such a can of worms. Not a can of worms for you and I, but a can of worms for people who might be listening. First of all, the term off the body, I
Okay.
think most people have no idea what that means. So how about if I give you a chance at least to define what you mean when you say off the body?
There's many ways for healing to take place, and as somatic experiencing providers, we're trained to be with the memories that are in the body and to work from the body itself.
Okay, so the memories that are lodged in the way the tissues, the ligaments, the musculature is organized based on freeze responses or other kinds of chronic hyperactivation responses. Is that what you mean?
Yes. And if we took a step into traditional Chinese medicine, or what body workers might consider, is that we can hold emotions in certain parts of the body, right? And they may say,
Right.
Anger's held in your liver.
As far as I know, in Chinese medicine, there are organ systems. We're talking about material that may be held in the subtle body nervous system as
Yes.
envisioned by the meridians and the qi and the jing in the Chinese medicine system. Yeah.
Yes.
And then there's another mapping, another topology for this over in the Ayurveda / Tibetan medicine system, where there's Pranabindu Nadi, there's the channels, there's the hubs, and then there's the prana that moves through them. And that particular, as far as my understanding is, that particular system is where those systems say trauma is held as image, as emotion, as all kinds of internal phenomena in that topology of the subtle body nervous system. So when we say off the body, we're not actually talking about that subtle body nervous system.
I would say we are.
For you, that is not in the body.
It's both in and off.
Okay, good. So now I hope this isn't too tedious. I think it's good for people to get a sense. This has a long tradition, and Western medicine doesn't have a long tradition of describing it, which is why this is so hard. What aspects of these topologies for the subtle body do you see as not residing within the physical body itself?
I hold the concept of as inside, so outside. So it's not that it's one place or another. It's just what's your point of entry. As a somatic therapist, my point of entry might have been I'm speaking about something and I'm feeling something happen. As I speak, I'm noticing a tightness in my chest. And as a biofield tuner, I'm not going to do that. We might talk ahead of time, but I might start in the subtle energy system to discern where there is tension in the body and locate it with the fork like a magnet. And then my conceptualization of it was that it felt very similar to somatic experiencing, because when I added the resonance of the fork to a place that there was no flow in the field, then uncoupling started to happen. And so the pieces of the memory became more available. And then with the fork, like a magnet, we are collecting the biophotons and bringing them into the energy center and integrating them through the chakra.
I have no experience with what you're talking about. I know tuning forks very well, but I've never used them in this way. So I'm extremely interested in what you're saying. You hit the tuning fork at a certain distance. You start to move the tuning fork closer to the patient's body itself.
Yes.
And you notice in your awareness certain kinds of shifts and perturbations as you move the tuning fork in the sound that it's emitting. Am I getting this correct?
Partially, yes. In the sound, that's one way. There's certain emotions, I would say, we're scaling through and we are able to sense into from the sound of the fork, the emotional tone. That if we think about part of what the bound energy is unprocessed emotions. Mm-hmm. Right? So the fork is toning those.
Okay, so we meaning this is a joint experience that you and the patient are both having?
They can hear the difference in the fork as well. You come into, again, this place that's either stagnant, which I decided to call uncoupled because it's sort of very spacious, and the sound kind of brings together the memory, or this idea of uncoupling where there's a breaking up of the density. The client will feel it in their nervous system. They'll feel the tingling, they'll feel the vibration, they may have an emotion. And so it felt very similar to somatic experiencing, but just in a very different way and gentle. Some people respond to sound. They came and said, my body loves sound. And I go to sound baths, or I come and do this, and it responds so well. It's so gentle on my system. It opened my mind and perspective to where memories are held.
When your mind had this other recognition about what memory is and where memory is held, what was different in your perception of memory?
Well, I think that I experienced myself before that in a very three-dimensional way. I have a body and my memories in my mind, or maybe it's in my body. But when I started to work with the sound, I started to become more aware of myself and my connection beyond the physical body. It opened me to understanding myself in a more expansive way. We see the pictures of a biofield, if you've seen a torrid field around a body.
Describe what that looks like as best you can.
This is the way we describe it in biofield tuning. We have an ascending current and a descending current. We think of it as our battery. We have a positive and a negative charge. And there's a flow of energy that runs through our central channel, and they're opposite. And as they move through, they also come out the top of our head, the bottom of our feet, and they create an orb around us. And there's two membranes to that orb. And this is what we would call the edges of the biofield. So that's the scientific name that has now been recognized. We can think of ourselves as energetic beings. This is our energy system that is influenced by our emotions, by our physiology, by our thoughts. And we can engage in practices through the tending to our energetic health, with sound being one of the tools now that's emerging as a new science and a new tool.
And has been used for millennia. This is not new. At some level, everything literally is vibrating, and that's all it is. If you are inducing or introducing a particular vibratory methodology to a system that is only just a vibratory system, I can see how what you're pointing at now is the way we think of illness is disturbance in the vibratory makeup of a given entity.
Yes, a lack of coherence.
Yeah.
And usually there's a mechanism of unprocessed emotions or trauma, right? Something that has caused
Yes.
a lack of flow. And we have different ways of creating the space to invite that to. I think there's a level of it coming into consciousness. For me, what I say is being seen, felt, heard, and experienced, so that it can transmute into something different.
Anything else that you've been using?
You know, for somatic providers, we don't have a lot of places to go next for our CEUs. So I ended up in brain spotting. I'll go over here and see what this is. And I just laughed when I arrived because, number one, I didn't know that it was somatic experiencing and EMDR combined.
Yeah, basically.
So I thought, all right, I can do this. And then I realized in the work, it's basically you're starting from the body, you're starting from the eyes, and you're finding the point where you connect into a memory. But because I'm so oriented now to the field around the body, I said, I'm in the same boat as I was just in with the tuning forks. Now I'm here doing it with brain spotting. So it was quite humorous. But David Grand, who created brain spotting, uses bilateral beats. So these are beats that cross the right and left hemispheres. There is some very gentle vagal nerve stimulation. And so I use that in my sound journeys. This is the way I describe it now as well. In ancient cultures, they may have a drum that they use and they hit it at a certain rate to take you into trance states. And so I don't have a drum. I use this music, and the music invites you into those same states.
Is he also using a vagal stimulator, or does the sound itself stimulate the vagus?
Yeah, the science behind that one is not as clear as the SSP. It is light vagal nerve stimulation. I'm not sure exactly what his program is doing to create the stimulation.
Okay.
It's moving the sound from one ear to the other. So you do feel that, very similar to EMDR.
Well, I'm imagining when you hit a tuning fork and you start bringing it toward a body, the vagal nerve is sending information about the experience that the internal system is having.
I started to think about the vagus nerve as a tuning fork, that it's being innervated. The person is being innervated via the vagal nerve. And then in some ways, we can think of the provider as a tuning fork as well. And so if we are in high resonance as a provider, and then we hit a fork or bring music into the field, we can then use our intention and our embodied presence to influence what happens in the space.
It seems like this is another way to induce energy wells, which is a somatic experiencing term. We're actually looking to excite the system to a certain extent so that there's certain kinds of regulatory processes that may not be happening naturally, that we can encourage to start happening in a controlled way for a short period of time. So we can basically titrate activation cycle and reintroduce to a system that's kind of lost the capacity for its own self-regulation, reintroduce, here's a path to come back into regulation. Yeah? Sounds like this is similar.
It is similar. I also speak about it as in somatic experiencing, we may work on a specific event, and the resolution of that event would then support the window of tolerance to increase because there's less energy being used to be focused on that, right? And with this, we are simply expanding the window through relational presence and the capacity to be in relationship and safe relationship. And so then the memories just start to process on their own.
Do your patients generally tell you about the resolution of the memories, or do they just sort of have them and then afterwards you get to hear about an experience that they may have had during this process that you're using?
It's different. The model I've fallen into lately, because I run groups mostly, but I do individual, is to listen to 15 minutes and then pause. It allows a natural pendulation. You come back into the left brain, talk about what happened. If we need to make sense, I can pull in internal family systems and work with parts. We can pull in somatic experiencing, any therapeutic skill set that needs to be there so they can hold the experience. I would say a lot of the work is inner child work. So it's bringing in those ways of holding the experience so that they can go back in again. And so then they'll go back in, and it's usually 30 minutes max listening. We don't go beyond that in a session.
This sounds really interesting because you found a methodology where more than one person can actually do this work. Are you in physical presence with them, or is this something you're doing through some kind of cyber portal?
Yes. So I would say we are meeting in a place in the middle of wherever we are in cyberspace. So they're all over the world, and I've gone up to groups of 12. If I have more than 6 people, I'll have a co-facilitator, because we do go into breakout rooms and process. And there's this element of bringing people together to heal, which has been just truly profound. The joy of the work is having people do the healing together. That brings us back to our humanity, our shared suffering. It normalizes that we're all working our way through being human. It allows for a lot of modeling and support and connection. So people are pretty surprised the degree of connection that they can make in this type of group.
If listeners were interested in doing this process with you, does it have a name? And
there's many providers using the Safe and Sound protocol. So I want to make note that everyone uses it differently. I call mine Rebirthing Ourselves, and it comes with a manual or a book that takes you through the evolution of the soul, the evolution of the psyche, and understanding ourselves as we move from energy into matter, and these developmental tasks that can become impeded when we don't have the relational support that would enable us to be our full self, the full version of us. We're also inviting ourselves to become unencumbered from the cultural, societal, biological conditioning that we've inherited, so that there is really an invitation to rebirth the self, the big S, right? To come back into a knowingness of ourselves as divine, right? And as connected to source. You know, what level someone gets to with that is different depending on their path and how much they've engaged in their own spiritual practice. There certainly is a reunion, a coming back to that inner child that Peter often talks about, the child that is full of spontaneity and joy and aliveness. There's a meditation at the beginning of the class and the end, and by the end, many people have a different relationship with that inner child.
So this sounds like it's an amalgamation of a lot of knowledge that you may have received through readings, through trainings.
Some of it was the incubation, and some of it is coming back to my roots. I started in Jungian therapy and Gestalt, coming back to my understanding of collective archetypes. I talk a lot about archetypes in the class, of the transpersonal and who we think we are. I think we can get caught in the daily, even myself, you know, of feeling ourselves just going through the motions of life and in the roles. I feel for myself, at least, that my journey for the last 6 years has been a dismantling, I would say, of the ego structures, coming to a deeper understanding of who I am without some of the inherited beliefs that prevent me from being able to imagine a different future for myself, or feel worthy of greater love, or feel I want to be a part of creating bigger change in the world because it is me and I am it. The constructs that prevented me from knowing that have been slowly stripping away over the last few years as I've deepened into all these different modalities, and they've allowed experiencing myself as source more and connected to source more. One of the things that happens in my programs that people, they kind of put their seatbelt on for, is the capacity to connect with non-ordinary states through dreams or meditation, and connecting through hearing and being and sensing that we are not alone and we are connected to our higher selves in whatever way that might show up. They may go on a sound journey and then have the craziest, wildest dreams, and their dream life starts to become vivid and sometimes prophetic. So normalizing We have this visual channel that allows us to see life, but an expanded channel allows us to see with another set of eyes. And that's perfectly within the context of being human.
So maybe they come thinking they're going to get some healing experience, but instead they start to experience aspects of their organism that may not have been apparent to them before.
Well, or I would even say they start to get connected to themselves as spiritual beings, right? That they are spirit in matter. They
Yeah.
may show up for more regulation.
That's a sticky wick because, unfortunately, the human mind can do all kinds of things with experiences that are novel and don't have any explanatory frame. I have a little difficulty when there's a dualistic perspective about spirit and matter. For me, the organism is all of it, because ultimately there is no world without any kind of perceptual apparatus, and all the perceptual apparatus resides in the organism. All the capacity for any non-ordinary experience resides in the way the human organism is structured. We have the receptors for non-ordinary experience because the organism is capable of providing all of this for itself. It doesn't need really any external anything, even though it's really important for us at certain points in our life to have methodologies like you've been describing to introduce capacities people have no idea that they innately have. And all this to me is very mundane. So I'm always a little suspect when spirituality gets introduced as something not mundane as having breakfast. I don't want listeners to think that you and I are talking about anything that is bypassing or elevating or saying to anybody, sorry, you just don't have this innately. This is something you have to go to somebody and get.
Oh, yeah.
I don't think it's something either of us want people to take away from this.
As the system and the body settles into safety, then we can start to be with more of our capacity to tap into all of our ways of knowing. And so that is the big trauma work that everyone's doing right now, to settle ourselves to become more embodied so that we can access more of our fuller potential, not have that energy being used to survive so we can thrive. It is interesting to see the different modalities and things that are emerging to invite us into a deeper relationship with ourselves.
Any other tools you've been exploring that you think we haven't talked about yet? Because these are all so fascinating.
There is one extra piece that comes with working with me that is unique. It's one I'm tracking fairly closely and still making sense of, but in the sound labs, when you're listening to the songs and the SSP or the bilateral beats, I will also hear songs playing in my own head. And they are sometimes really cheesy songs from the 70s or the 60s, or they're the Beatles. When I give the songs to the people or the group, and it takes them into really deep emotional spaces, it's been consistent enough that I'm starting to develop an idea and try to make sense of, maybe what is healing at a collective level. Because I think there's this element of the morphic field, or whatever we call that field, where we're all going through some of the same processes. And I have started to consider that these songs speak to those. What they speak to is a rebalancing of our inner archetypes within. Some of them are hard to hear because they're, cheesy love songs, but they go somewhere inside and tap into some pretty deep grief and allows it to start to unwind. It's both fun and curious still.
Have you tried this with anyone who isn't our age, who didn't grow up with this incredible music from the 60s, 70s, and it has the same effect?
Well, that's a good question. I've had a couple young 20-ish people have said, can you see if that, morphic field can give you some songs by Taylor Swift? For me, it just doesn't seem to happen. So I don't know if that's because that's the songs from my genre. I'm not understanding why Taylor Swift doesn't pop in, but Cat Stevens does.
That would be so interesting to explore.
I've been thinking about artists, and I know I've heard Bonnie Raitt talk about it, that she said, I just pulled it down. I just pulled the words down.
Well, maybe at some point, if you work with enough younger people, rap will do it and Taylor Swift will do it.
There's something timeless about some of the songs. A lot of them are Beatles songs, and at one point I said, the Beatles sang about love a lot.
Well, I can't wait to hear where that goes.
Me too. I will keep you posted. I'm just allowing it to flow, and most people in the groups are very receptive, and then they give me their feedback after.
So do you just introduce it sort of spontaneously?
Usually in the sound journey, they'll go through the journey, and at the end I'll say, here's the songs that I heard while you were all doing your sound journey. Then they take those home and listen during the week. If I'm seeing someone individual, then we'll talk in the session, and we'll start to feel into what the songs are in a session. So I'll do it. It depends if I'm seeing you individually or in a group.
Are you doing any in-person work with anyone at this point, or are you completely online with your work?
Completely online at this point. I have a podcast now since we last met, talking to my podcast host, and we hold sound yoga baths. And we use Dr. Porges as a new program. So we use that program, which I'm not talking about so much yet because it's not out. We are toying with doing those live in a sound bath type of setting and seeing what that's like. We'll see, because so far this has all been online and people are in the privacy of their own home, and they can lie on their couch or their bed, and which has worked out really well. I think people are ready for in-person experiences, so we'll see. I haven't sat with a large group of people since embodied recovery, where I was sitting with 25 people teaching. I'm not sure, but it feels important to be available in different ways. If I had assistants and people there, then I could hold some space for a group live.
Well, were you in the part of North Carolina that was devastated by the hurricane?
I'm about 3 hours, but I do have teachers from my school and friends that are in Asheville. Very much looks like a war zone up there right now.
It's hard to imagine, honestly.
Yeah, it's devastated. So part of what I'm doing is offering some free opportunities for providers to come learn about these sound groups so they can then take those into the communities. We need more healing groups and spaces to do small group healing. That it's time in the world for that. And I think sound is an easy pathway.
And here we are, 2 days since.
No.
I don't know what to call what has just happened. I don't want to put you on the spot, although I thought I would give you an opportunity if you have any wisdom that you would like to offer. Obviously, there are many people in this country, I guess, who are celebrating. Lots of people who I think are shell-shocked.
We just spoke about this on our podcast this morning. A lot of what Leslie and I speak about is being heart-centered with yourself. And so for us, that means holding space for your own emotions. So first we have to do that for ourselves before we do that for others. allowing ourselves a space to have all the emotions that we're feeling right now, whatever those might be, and honoring those and allowing them to be felt in embodied ways. So if it's anger, feel it in an embodied way. You move, do something with it. If it is sorrow or sadness, be with those parts that feel the sorrow, sadness. And I'm seeing a lot of people come together in groups. Over here, at least they are. Some people feel like they're grieving. And so some people feel like they need to grieve in groups. For some, sound, movement, somatics, breath, I mean, all the tools that we have all been introduced to and using, this is the time to use them to help ourselves to move through and not get stuck.
I think that is absolutely fantastic and very practical advice for people, because I think people are afraid to show, even to themselves, the depths of what may be coming up for them. Even if around you there's mass confusion, it's very important to hold to the clarity in your own center, because nobody can take that away.
Yes.
No matter how hard they try.
I talk a lot about frequency and vibration and how we are essentially tuning forks. And so if you're around a lot of sympathetic charge, it can influence you. And so just being aware of what's around you, because it can sway your nervous system one direction or another. Take care of your nervous system health right now.
And for someone who's not actually engaged in any specific work, what would be a simple measure that they could take to care for the nervous system?
My two favorites right now, one is, as I've worked more and more with sound, I've really given myself permission to make noise when I sigh, when I exhale, and whatever sound wants to come out. And so take some breaths, and on the exhale, let yourself make noise.
Would you be willing to lead listeners in a deep in-breath and a nice exhale?
Sure. Finding your feet on the ground, if you're standing or sitting, and giving yourself permission to find that breath. And I like to think of it, it's coming from the belly and it's expanding out and filling your torso, your lungs. So full breath. And on the exhales, you come to the top, give it a moment, and exhale with whatever sound wants to come out. Do that together. I just gave the example that was the sound available, but you could make it a ah or an o or a oo. So whatever tone, and maybe give 3 of those for yourself. So I'll do 2 more then. And not forgetting, we always have the VU too, right? But
Yay, VU.
yay, VU. But there's way more tones than just VU. You know, VU is just one. And so in this current week, we need many tones beyond the VU, probably.
Indeed, yes.
Yeah.
Favorite systems. Qigong actually has these healing sounds, and they're often associated with very specific movements for mental health interventions. And so if anybody's interested in that, you can Google Qigong healing sounds. They are organized around very specific emotions and the sound you can make in order to allow the emotion to come up in the system and be released. So that's another one of these wonderful systems that's been around forever.
Thank you for reminding us. Yeah.
Thank you for leading us through that breath.
And that falls in line. I'm a big fan of authentic movement. And with authentic movement, which is it's a form of dance therapy where you allow the body to move in whatever way it needs to. But with that, there's an invitation for breath and sound. It can be really interesting to just make sounds and see where that takes you. So I invite people, go beyond even the 3 breaths that I offered, because sound can take you into some deep places if you give permission.
Wonderful.
In fact, we can give that as another tool today because music can take us through emotional tones and experiences and is a beautiful way to go in movement and music together going into the body.
Yeah, this is one of my favorite interventions for my depressed patients who always say to me, I say, honestly, the thing that tests better than anything is exercise. And they're like, I hate exercise, or I don't want to do it. And I'll just say, great, pick your favorite song, put it on really loud and dance around the room for 5 to 10 minutes. There it is. You've done it.
I agree. It doesn't cost any money. Don't have to go to the gym.
And it's your favorite song. So you also get all those nice endorphins running in your brain. Yeah.
Yeah. Very practical. There's lots of different things people can do right now. I'm glad we named a couple of them.
Me too. And I think it's important to remind people we like to find comfort in predicting, depending on our point of view. But I think life has a way of showing up in infinite varieties of experience that our small human minds can't even come close to predicting. So maybe backing away a little bit from grasping at knowing how this is all going to go.
So to ungrasp, we need to feel something under our feet. And so if we can tune into that and connect to the earth, yield into that support, then we can sit back and allow the mystery to unfold a little bit. And, it's a delicate dance. Some days we're better at that than others.
Yes, but that kind of ground is always there.
It is always there. It's always there.
Yes. And I am a big fan of people having intimacy with that kind of ground and then stepping into the groundless ground, which is the ultimate ground. Yet there's nothing to stand on. Yeah. And I think that maybe is a little of what you were pointing at earlier with this integral, spacious openness, which is lucidity itself, that basic capacity for knowing and for aliveness.
And to feel life moving through us, how do we find those places where we contract against life?
I pretty much think anybody who's listening to this can think back to a moment where music did that for them.
Yay for music. We're going to bring this forward. Let's bring it on now.
I think it's fantastic that you're willing to bring this to the psychotherapy community, as well as just to the community at large as a way to connect. I'm really, really excited about this direction that you've taken.
Well, thank you for having me and sitting and chatting about it and unpacking it with me. It's been fun.
Tell people how they can get in touch with you.
My website is www.paulascataloni.com, and my podcast is Embodied Step Into You. I'm also on Instagram and LinkedIn.
Okay, well, be well. And my heart goes out to all your friends in Asheville, North Carolina. May Asheville find its way back to the glorious place it was.
Thank you. It's been great hanging out with you. Thanks again.
Thanks for listening to today's show. To get in touch, please visit groundlessground.com. Let's dedicate our efforts to the healing of our planet and all its inhabitants. See you next time on the Groundless Ground.